Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good evening to everyone. Firstly, I would like to thank, I don't know whether I should thank the organizers at all for putting me in this very uncomfortable position of having to talk about whether there would be better times for politics in Malaysia. Well, I've been asked to predict many things, and as you know, most of my predictions did not come out right. So if I'm wrong again this time, you should really expect this. But when one is asked to predict the future, I always feel that the best thing to do this is to look back at the past. Because trends form during the passage of time, and these trends tend to continue almost along straight lines. However, there were times when there could be some radical changes, like revolutions or Arab Springs and the like. When the trends stop or change direction, and you could hardly recognize what is happening, much less predict what would happen. But Malaysia has bucked the trend many times, and I expect it may do so again. I say Malaysia has bucked the trend because the prediction for Malaysia from the very beginning was very gloomy. At the time when we were struggling for independence, and I was fortunate, I was still alive at that time. Most people were not born yet. But at that time, I watched as the comments were made about Malaysia. We have the Chinese in the past living in the towns. In fact, they built the towns. The Malays largely live in the rural areas, except for the few government servants. And the Indians were largely in the rubber estates. So they don't live together, they live apart. They could hardly talk to each other. Where there are concentrations of people of one race, they use their own language and cannot converse with people from other places, other races. So that was the situation when we were struggling for independence, and many people say that if independence is granted to Malaysia, the Malays who outnumbered the rest would immediately dispossess all the other races of their wealth. But as you know, we bucked that prediction because instead of seizing the wealth of people of other races in Malaysia, the Malays actually decided to share this country with the others. Now this is quite different from what happened in many other countries. In many other countries, the indigenous people would want to get rid of the so-called newcomers, people of other races. Myanmar is a good example. In Myanmar, the Indians dominated the economy. They were the wholesalers, and they were the retailers as well in all the Burmese towns. And this caused resentment among the Burmese. And when they became independent, they expelled the Indians and took over their property. The same thing was expected to be seen in Malaysia. But instead of that happening, not only were the Malays willing to share the countries with the non-indigenous people, but they actually reduced their political influence by increasing the numbers of non-Malays who qualified to become citizens, who were made citizens. They were not qualified, but they were made they were allowed to become citizens. So this is not the usual thing that happens. And we see that accommodation is the trend in Malaysia. We expected, of course, at that time, I was very conscious at that time that despite the fact that we accepted people of other races, non-Malays, to become citizens, we did expect them to use the Malay language, which was designated the national language, and also that they would go to the same schools together, and eventually there would be some, not assimilation, some integration among the three races. However, this did not happen. They went to schools when these were English schools, but the moment the English schools were converted to national schools, people went back to their own schools. The Chinese went back to the Chinese schools, the Indians went back to the Tamil schools, and the national schools had almost entirely a Malay population. So what we had expected to happen did not happen. But that was all right, because the Malays felt that, well, if they don't want to learn the national language, what can we do? What could we do? We put up with it, and we don't talk about these things, because to talk about these things would incur the displeasure of people. And so, despite language days, language weeks, language months, and language years, I don't know whether people remember this, but we were quite serious about promoting the national language so that it becomes the language of the nation. But eventually, actually, the Malays gave up. People are not going to use Malay. They would rather use English. And also, this is the fault of the Malays themselves. When people talk to them in Malay, they get mystified. They couldn't understand that people could actually talk in their language. And if they have any speaking knowledge of English, they would reply in English. So people never bothered to learn Malay because they can get along by using English. I noticed that diplomats who were sent to Indonesia, for example, would master some knowledge of that language. But in Malaysia, they don't. Malaysian diplomats, some of them have been here even after they have served their term. They stayed here, but they never learned the language. They can get by with some English. This is the fault of the Malays, because if these diplomats talk to them in Malay, they reply in English. So the Malays are at fault themselves, but others are also at fault because they find it not really necessary to master the language. So the language factor as a unifying force just did not work. Culture, of course, is, at first the culture of the country was supposed to be Malay, almost entirely, but eventually the needs of tourism, for example, when we decided to make Malaysia the truly Asia, Malaysia truly Asia, to show that Malaysia is truly Asia, we like to promote the cultures of all the three different races in Malaysia, and then of course the idea about one national culture based on Malay began to recede, and this did not happen at all. Also, when the schools were converted to national schools, the Chinese schools prospered because Chinese prefer to go back to their schools, and there they speak not Malay, they speak Mandarin, of course, they speak their own dialect perhaps, but certainly the influence of language in bringing people together was almost completely lost. We did try, for example, at least to have a common campus, bring all the three schools together on a common campus so that they can continue to be taught in their own languages, but for certain other school activities, they can be together. School assemblies, for example, could be together, and Malay could be used, or national language could be used. When talking to the students, they could play games together, not based on, not teams coming from the separate schools, but one can form teams, mixed teams from all the three schools. That way, they would know each other, even though they may not be integrated. The other thing that is divisive, of course, is the differences in religion. The Muslim religion in Malaysia is quite lax in many ways. We don't have to keep beards, and all of us. But you know, in some countries, if you don't keep beard, a Muslim might have his head chopped off. But that is other countries. In Malaysia, we are tolerant, which explains why I am still alive. So, and in any case, somehow or other, religion is a barrier to intermarriage, for example. So, instead of the expected integration, if not assimilation of the races in Malaysia, the races seems to be moving away from each other over the years. This is the trend, and it affects politics, of course. Initially, we decided that we should work together, support each other's party, but in the last election, everybody is agreed that the voting was based more on race than on ideologies or on the capability of the parties or the persons concerned. We vote mainly because we are of that race. If you are Chinese, we vote for the Chinese. If you are Malay, we vote for the Malays generally. If you are Indians, we are forced. You are forced to vote for somebody else because there are not enough Indians around. So that is the political situation today. There is much less closeness of the different races. We seem to become more racist as time passes by. Now, how will this affect the future? Will this trend continue? It is very difficult to say because the unfortunate thing is among the educated people, there is still this very strong adherence to race. We should think that the educated would set the trend, that they should be together because they have to live together. But unfortunately, because of certain kinds of politics, even the educated in Malaysia do not come together, are not as close together as they should be. If this continues, of course, we will be less integrated, and certainly we will not see assimilation of the races in this country. Now, if that happens, and of course the disparities between the different races continues, the future will not look very bright for Malaysia. We need some very strong parties to govern this country. I believe in democracy, but I don't believe in liberal democracy. I think a developing country should have strong governments, and the government should stay on for a longer period of time, because it takes time for any ideas to be implemented effectively. So we need a strong government, and a strong government is not something that people will accept as being democratic. We want to see weak governments. But then if we have weak governments, and the last election did not produce a strong government, then the implementation of unpleasant laws and policies becomes difficult. You need a strong government to implement unpleasant laws, which may be necessary, unpleasant policies which are also necessary. If you have a weak government, the tendency is for the government to try and please everyone. And when you try to please everyone, you will soon find yourself very unpopular, very unpopular with everyone, because every time you try to please someone, someone else becomes very unhappy. That is because we are not assimilated, we are not integrated, and one man's food is somebody else's poison, so to speak. So if this trend continues, then we are not going to see a better Malaysia. But I'm still hopeful that people will come to their senses. What is more important is the well-being of the people, not the freedom so much. I believe that the freedoms that you see in some of the so-called developed countries are not really, attractive. We see collapse of moral values, for example, because of too much, almost unlimited freedom. Anybody can say that he is exercising his rights when doing whatever, but his rights may result in other people losing their rights. And that is why when we talk about freedom, we should also talk about limits to freedom. When I was in charge of the multimedia super corridor, we used to have an international panel of advisors. And I was asked by one American lady whether we are going to censor the internet or not. Well, I wanted to be admired and praised by her. And I told her, no, we are not going to censor at all. We are going to be very free. But I am now having second thoughts. Not because of anything, because when you have absolute freedom, people abuse the freedom. When you're thinking about giving freedom, you think that things would not change very much. It's about something very normal. But once you give freedom to people, they tend to abuse it. And today we find people provoking each other with statements that will not cause us to become closer together. We are no longer willing to restrain ourselves in making comments about other people's religion. And this is very sensitive. But then, of course, this is an exercise in freedom. I will admit that when Hillary Clinton defended the people who insulted the Prophet of Islam as something about exercising the right of free speech, I wrote in my column something, in my blog, something very nasty about American women. It's not true at all. Well, it is only half true, not completely untrue. I wrote very nasty thing about American women, and I know it is going to be, people would not like what I say, Americans would not like what I say. But if they say, why do you say such a thing? I was prepared with a reply. I was exercising my freedom of speech. So you can see that when you have unlimited freedom, the multiracial society like Malaysia may end up with people quarreling or fighting against each other. Fortunately, Malaysia, of course, we are not violent people. We don't assassinate people. There was one case where one minister was supposed to have assassinated or shot somebody, but I'm not very sure that he did so. But in other countries, you know, before an election is held, 20 or 30 people would have been shot. It happened among our neighbors, not very far away, and it happens in many countries. During election, before election, and even after elections, people get shot. But in Malaysia, we are very kind. I can still walk around the town and have not been shot so far. In fact, I was having a cup of coffee in one of those cafes, and then an Arab man passed. He went past me, and then he came back. He says, you are having coffee? He said, yes. Alone? Yes. Where are your bodyguards? So there was some bodyguards somewhere. I don't know, but they were not near me. But this is normal in Malaysia. Ex-prime ministers can actually walk around and not be shot. But in other countries, they would be shot. So we are fortunate in that we are not violent. But we need to be more sensible with regard to this multiracial country of ours. If we want to have a better Malaysia, we should tone down a little bit on the freedoms that we have. We should limit ourselves. We should self-regulate. If we do that, I am sure that this country, which has bucked trends before, will continue to buck trends. Although people will say that this country is going to see clashes and fights and Arab Springs and all that, I think it will not. It will not, because we are not violent people. And we should control ourselves a little bit more. I'm quite sure then Malaysia will continue to progress. We know, of course, that stability, peace and stability is absolutely essential if the country is going to make progress. Up to now, although we may have some tension, some racial issues, sensitive issues being discussed, still the country is quite stable, and we are still doing fairly well in terms of the economy. To grow at all in these days is something of an achievement. Europe is not growing. In fact, it is regressing. Even America is not doing well. Abenomics may work in Japan, but how long Mr. Abe is going to be allowed to be Prime Minister is something that we cannot be sure of, because in Japan, everybody must have his turn at becoming Prime Minister every 2 years. That's why I'm against changing the present leader of UMNO. I told them, please don't contest because you don't understand democracy. In other countries, when you contest, you lose, you wait until the next election. But in this country, if you contest and you lose, you go to the courts. And then you form your own party and you split the party some more. So that contributes towards instability. So the future of politics in Malaysia is, I think, not too bad, but you are going to see more and more insensitivity on the part of Malaysians. I do hope that the thinking Malaysians will try and vote into power a much stronger government, because governments have to do unpleasant things. We have to pass laws which curb the freedom of people, the way they do business, the way they behave themselves. We need to curb them because although we are very intelligent people, very civilized people, but there are things that we do which seems to be quite uncivilized. So we do need government. It was Mr. Reagan who said that we need less government. The market will regulate itself. And the market regulated itself. That is why they had the subprime crisis and the collapse of the economy. The markets cannot regulate itself. You need a government to regulate the market and the people in general. We need to have a fairly strong government. When you have a government that is exposed to pressures coming from outside and from inside, you are not going to have an effective government that can deal with the crisis, with the problems that will occur in any society. You see now that the government has got to listen to what the opposition is saying. My belief is that when the opposition says something, please ignore it. I ignored it for 22 years and I survived. You know, the opposition said, well, you always cheat at elections, so we must have this indelible ink put on your finger. That will stop the cheating. And so the government did. But still the government gets accused of fraud. Indelible ink or whatever you do is a nice issue for the opposition. They're not going to give up simply because you comply. So government should not listen to the opposition. Ignore them. Because they're not interested in making things better. They're not interested even in making elections cleaner. They want an issue. And if you do something that may reduce the credibility of their accusation, they will find a way of continuing with the issue. And so, as you see, despite the government using indelible ink, allowing Malaysians living abroad to vote, all this was because the opposition wanted it. At the end of the election, although the opposition did rather well, they still complain. They still complain that the government has cheated. I believe that when there is real cheating, the government normally wins 99% of the votes. You look at Egypt under Mubarak. Every time they have elections, the government party gets 99% of the votes. Then, of course, there must be cheating. But in Malaysia, there has never been an election in which some opposition members have not been elected. Some will be elected. And indeed, in Malaysia, there were times when 5 different states fell into the hands of the opposition. Now, if the government is cheating, they will not get any state at all. And sometimes the government party or the opposition wins by a very small margin. I should imagine it would be easy to cheat when the margin is quite small. It shouldn't happen at all. But you see in the last election and the previous elections too, the opposition in Malaysia can win in elections. There's never been a parliament where there is no opposition members. There is one country nearby where the government party had to create its own internal opposition to have some opposition. I always believe that oppositions are necessary because they function like a mirror. You know, if you look at the mirror properly, of course, you'll find that all those warts on your faces will be seen by you. But if you don't look at the mirror at all, you may think you have very smooth skin. So you need a mirror. And the opposition performs this function of being a mirror. But this one is a cracked mirror because even if you are very beautiful, you look horrible in their eyes. So oppositions are necessary to make democracies work. But when the opposition refuses to accept a reality of what happens, when the opposition won quite substantially in Malaysia, they still insist that it was due to fraud. They should actually have been the government of Malaysia long ago, not just this time. And so they are going to have demonstrations to prove that the government has cheated. Now, one of the things about democracy, if you really want to practice democracy, you must accept that somebody must be defeated. You can't have everybody winning. You can't have the opposition and the government party winning. If the government party wins, the opposition loses. If opposition wins, the government party loses. You have to accept losing. But they only want to accept winning. If they lose, then there must be fraud. And as a result, of course, the democracy does not function well. The other thing which I remark, of course, is that when there is an intra-party election, the losing faction tends to break off and form their own party. This means that we really do not understand what democracy is all about. Democracy can only work if you accept not just winning, but also losing. And when you lose, wait until the next election and try again. Don't form another party. Don't accuse the government of fraud. Just wait. When your turn comes and you become the government, you can rest assured that the government which has been displaced and now becomes the opposition will also accuse you of fraud. See, because this is politics, you know. And politics is not always rational. You tend to make use of whatever issue that you find or you can make. So accusing the government of fraud is something that all opposition parties like to do. But you can accuse, but don't disrupt the country. Don't hold demonstrations. Street demonstrations are not very productive. So if we are more mature and we accept that when we lose elections, we wait for the next election, this country will have a better future. I think we are going towards there because this time around, although the opposition accused the government of fraud, we find that they are broken up. Of the 3 parties forming the opposition, only one party is demonstrating. The other two seems to be much more sensible. I really did not believe they could be sensible, but this time they are. They actually told their partner in the opposition that they are not going to have this 505 or whatever. So we are maturing. Even the opposition is maturing. Although the opposition leader may not last that long because we are all getting old, including me. But I am sure that Malaysia will be able to overcome most of these challenges. We have done so in the past. I think we will do so again. But the regretful thing is that we are not coming together. If we come together, if we speak the national language better, not all the time. At home you can speak your own language, but we should use the national language more. We should have less separation in the schooling system. For example, we should have a national school where everybody would attend. Of course, they will preserve their language. It will be compulsory to learn one's own language, but go to the same schools. I think the chances of integration and keeping Malaysia stable and peaceful would be better. I am myself a product of the English school, of course, where we went to school together with Chinese, Indians, Bengalis, Sranis and all that. They are all there, and I had friends. I formed a strong friendship with them until I grow old. They are still my friends, although not many of them have survived. But that is, that is a natural process of things anyway. But we need to go to the same school. I think if we can persuade each other to go to the same school, it would be better. There have been a suggestion that we bring back the English schools. I would think that would be a very backward step. But I think that if we bring back to a national school where English is made compulsory and the study of science and math is done in English, that... Thank you. Thank you very much. You know, I introduced this, and when I stepped down, they reversed my decision. That's why I wanted to become Prime Minister again. Just for 1 minute to reverse their decision. After that, I will step down again, I promise. You know, if we have these schools where the teaching is in Malay, Chinese and Tamil and all that will be made available to everyone who wants to learn Chinese and Tamil. The teaching of science and math will be in English. English will be a compulsory subject. I think we would be able to achieve, at least most of the people will go to the same schools. And this would help to have a better future for Malaysia. That is my view. And of course I won't be able to see it, but that's all right. And I'm quite sure you, do I have to answer questions? Yes or no? Yes, okay. So I will stop there. You can ask questions. If I can answer, I will try.